Hey everyone, it's me, Jakov, and I'm back again with a new installment in my series, Units of Total War, Rise of Mordor. Today we'll be looking at a faction that I've been waiting to cover for ages, the Kingdom of Gondor. If you're new to the channel, in this series, I look at a faction in the mod Rise of Mordor for the game Total War Attila, the mod linked in the description of course, going over the history of the faction within the books and films of Tolkien's universe, before looking at the real-life civilizations that inspired them. After that, I look at the units the faction brings to the battlefield, discussing their role and how they can be used, as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic the units are. With that out of the way, let's begin the breakdown of Gondor as a faction. Gondor is a kingdom of man located in the southern portion of Middle-earth, being among the greatest civilizations of men in the west, while also being a chief enemy of the forces of the Dark Lord Sauron. Looking at its history, Gondor's origins lie back in the Second Age of Middle-earth, being founded by the Faithful, a group of Númenóreans, themselves an ancient civilization which had bested Sauron in the past. Númenor being an island west of Middle-earth, which I personally view as a bit of a mix of Atlantis and America, sending armies to fight in continental wars against enemies to the east. See the similarities? Going back to the Faithful, after Númenor was corrupted and turned against the greater powers of the universe, the island was sunk by the power of Eru Ilúvatar, the god in Tolkien's Legendarium. However, those who remained loyal to Eru were able to sail to Middle-earth, joining together with some of the Númenórean colonies in Middle-earth to found the twin kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor, Arnor to the north and Gondor to the south, Arnor being a faction that I will cover in a future video when it's added to the mod. After being at peace for 100 years or so, Gondor was invaded by the forces of Mordor, leading to the War of the Last Alliance, which you see in the opening prologue of the Fellowship of the Ring film. Fighting alongside the elves and Arnor, eventually the war ended in a victory for Gondor when Sauron was defeated, with Isildur, the king of Gondor, claiming the One Ring of Sauron before taking his place as the new king of Arnor, right before being killed by orcs. All this taking place during the closing days of the Second Age and the early Third Age. As the Third Age of Middle-earth went on, Gondor became the preeminent power in Middle-earth, creating a vast empire stretching over large parts of the continent. However, while Gondor at its height was nigh unassailable, after countless centuries of civil war and foreign invasions, as well as devastating plagues, the power of the kingdom waned, made even more worse by the loss of their royal line, rule of the kingdom being granted to the stewards of Gondor. By the end of the Third Age, the period in which the Lord of the Rings takes place, the kingdom was ringed by enemies, including the rising power of Mordor, close to collapsing under the weight of enemy attacks. Structure-wise, Gondor had a central army, with the fiefdoms comprising the kingdom supplementing the armed forces of it with feudal levies. Throughout the events of Lord of the Rings, Gondor was the linchpin for the free peoples of Middle-earth, being targeted by Sauron for destruction, with its capital city, Minas Tirith, close to falling until relieved by a Rohirrim army, as well as an army of the dead or of Gondor's southern fiefs, depending on the story told in the films or the books. After being saved from destruction, the armies of Gondor would march on Mordor, led by the heir to the throne of Gondor, the Northern Ranger Aragorn, attempting to draw out the forces of Mordor and clearing the way for the Ring-bearer to destroy the Ring of Power and Sauron, winning the War of the Ring and saving the free peoples of Middle-earth. Now that we've looked at the history of Gondor from an in-universe perspective, let's look at where it draws inspiration from historically, in both the books and the films. As a once great civilization that has been ground away by endless war and plague, threatened with destruction by a rising power to the east, Gondor most reminds me of the Byzantine Empire, being a descendant of a once mighty empire, the Romans for the Byzantines and Númenor for the Gondorians, with the ultimate fate of both being decided by a final ultimate siege of their heavily fortified capital cities, with Minas Tirith surviving the onslaught of Mordor, unlike Constantinople which fell to the Ottomans after a titanic siege in which the Ottomans deployed siege weapons on a scale never seen before, such as their Great Bombard, an analogue for the great battering ram Grond used by the Orcs to knock down the gates of Minas Tirith. While Gondor draws inspiration from the Byzantines for its general structure in the books and films, its depiction is based more on Imperial Rome and the marble-filled cities of the Empire, which is a staple in pop culture, with its military drawing inspiration from the heavily armed men-at-arms and dismounted knights of the 15th and 16th century, wearing extensive plate armor in battle against their enemies. With all that said, I consider this a fair breakdown of Gondor's real and fictional history. So let's now move on to the units that Gondor can field in Total War Rise of Mordor, beginning with one of their general units, the Knights of the Silver Swan. And here we have the Knights of the Silver Swan, and as you can immediately see, they are very, very, very heavy shock cavalry. What a glorious unit they are. Now, as I said before, these guys are one of the general units for the faction, and that's the thing, Gondor can field several different general units, depending on what type of army you're trying to go for. I picked the Swan Knights as the general unit in this video, just because I'm really a big fan of their appearance, and I feel they stand out more compared to the others, at least in some ways. And I think they make for a greater type of general unit, just because they are cavalry, given that most generals in history were mounted rather than dismounted. Not all, but most. Taking a look at these guys, as you can see, they're covered in armor from head to toe, and all of them wear plate armor. They've got breastplates, they've got van braces, they've got pauldrons. Their helmets look akin to ancient Greek helmets such as the Corinthian hoplite helmet. However, that's not actually what it's based on in universe, or at least that's not what the designers based the design of their helmets on. Instead, their helmets are based on the barbute, a type of helmet that became quite prominent in Italy in the 15th, 16th centuries, maybe the 14th too. These were helmets that were designed off of ancient Greek and Roman helmets, in particular the ancient Greek Corinthian helmet. So it makes sense that these helmets resemble those, because in real life those helmets were based off of ancient Greek helmets. As you can see, each man's helmet has a swan engraved onto it, with swan wings sticking out of the sides of the helmets. And this makes sense in universe, because these are knights from Dol Amroth, Dol Amroth being one of the tributary fiefs of Gondor. As a tributary fief of Gondor, Dol Amroth is required to provide troops for war when Gondor needs them. The troops that Dol Amroth provides to the armies of Gondor are heavy shock cavalry, the Knights of Dol Amroth. As well as their cavalry, Dol Amroth also fields infantry too. The reason why I brought this up is because the symbol of the fief of Dol Amroth is the white swan. So it makes sense for troops hailing from this region to decorate their armor with the symbols of their home, in particular the white swan that you can see mounted on their shields as well as on their helmets, and also the white ships, because Dol Amroth is a coastal fief, so it also makes sense for them to have symbols tying them to the ocean as well. Now, as for the helmets being decorated as such, is this historic? Yes and no. It is well known that there were helmets in history, particularly in the Middle Ages, that did have decorations put onto them such as wings and the like. For example, looking at the Teutonic Order, there are images in the past of Teutonic knights having wings attached to their helmets. However, whether or not such attachments were used in battle, that's up for interpretation. A lot of people believe that they were solely used for decoration and for ceremonial purposes. Others believe that it was a mix of the two and that they were mostly used on a ceremonial basis. However, they would occasionally be used in battle. In this case, I see it as kind of fair to include them as having these wings on their helmets. I think it helps set them apart, and it also ties them together to history, in which you do have historical units having wings and other such attachments on their helmet. So they're all mounted on chargers, and their horses are not heavily armoured. Their horses' heads do have protection for it, which was something that was done in history. Covering your horses in metal does protect them quite a bit from battle damage. The top of their necks have plate armour, which was also done historically. The rest of the horse is mostly unarmoured, if not completely unarmoured, except for being covered in cloth, which was done historically quite a lot. Not all armoured cavalry had armoured horses, so it does make sense. These guys aren't necessarily cataphracts, such as those fielded by the Easterling faction, but they are still heavy shock cavalry nonetheless. They just happen to not armour their horses, which historically plausible. The fabric covering their horses bears the symbol of their fief, the white swan, and that completely makes sense. This was also done historically, having your horse bear symbols and emblems of your homeland or your personal symbol. Completely realistic. Now, looking at the arms and the shields used by these troops, that's a little bit weird. So for starters, they're all armed with these long spears. So as you can see, each spear has a long blade. What these spears remind me of, or in this case lances, they remind me less of European lances and spears, and more of Japanese naginata and yari. And if you ever see photos of those, you'll definitely know what I'm talking about. They really do look like them, especially having a long blade on the edge rather than just a spiky point, like more regular spears. So I guess that means these weapons double as both stabbing weapons and shooting weapons, being able to slash and stab. Now, one thing to keep in mind, these spears slash lances this is not going to be the only time you see him in this faction roster. One thing that Gondor does very well is that it has military standardization. A lot of units bear the same arms and armor as a way of cutting down costs of production for Gondor, which I quite like, and which makes sense for a kingdom that is constantly at war, that it's needed to shorten its production line so in order to defend itself. Now, we've looked at the spears, let's look at their shields. And this is something that is both historic and ahistoric, and in order for you to understand what I mean, you have to take the unit in as a whole. So these are men covered in plate from head to toe. The era in which warriors were mounted as such and equipped as such was during the 15th centuries and the 16th centuries. By the time knights, or men-at-arms, similar heavy troops, had armor levels reach such a high, they didn't really use shields anymore because there was really no purpose for shields. Their armor was so good at protecting them that they didn't need shields. They just let their armor protect them while they attacked. More so now with two-handed weapons. They could afford to use both hands on the offense instead of having to use one arm to hold a shield and then use a one-handed weapon in the other hand. For cavalry this well equipped, they shouldn't need shields at all, and these shields look to be heater shields, which were used in history in the 14th century, 13th century. You definitely had knights using shields such as these. By the time you have heavy cavalry equipped such as this, use of heater shields was most definitely dying out. While I say that, there were still some knights who did use shields, even to the end of the Middle Ages. So it's not completely ahistoric for some warriors to be using shields. It just seems a bit weird that this very elite unit, who more so than anyone else would have discarded shields by now, are using shields. But it's fiction. And I understand some people see it's fiction as a cop-out. But in this case, it also kind of matches along with other trends that you're going to see this faction have, of having heavily armoured troops who still use shields even though they don't really need to use shields. Or the shields may seem a bit superfluous. They could be put to use in battle as well, so they're not entirely useless. So for that, I'll also kind of give them a pass, both on the usefulness of the shields as well as the fact that in history there were troops who did use such shields. So these are the Knights of the Silver Swan, and let's find their commanding officer, and here he is. And he doesn't look any different from the rest of his men, except for the fact that he uses a sword. His sword looking to be an arming sword or a bastard sword. The hilt of the sword is quite interesting. It's shaped like a swan, which again makes sense, the whole swan motif for the Swan Knights. And is that historic? I don't know if there's a particularly shaped hilt with a swan on it, but there were definitely highly ornate and decorated hilts. So in this case, I wouldn't see it as being historically implausible. Apart from that, his equipment looks much the same as the rest of his troops, except for his breastplate. And I don't know if you can see it, but his breastplate is slightly more decorated than the rest of the troops. The rest all have the symbol of the White Tree of Gondor on it, which makes sense because while they are Knights of Dol Amroth, they're also men of Gondor, so they're equipped with the symbols of the fief and the kingdom that they are loyal to. Apart from that, looking at this commanding officer's breastplate, it does have some inlaid gold on it, and that was absolutely done historically. But apart from the inlaid gold, I can't really find anything else to talk about with this man. He's equipped much the same as the rest of his troops. As for these guys' role on the battlefield, they are heavy shot cavalry. They will demolish enemy units if you attack them from the rear or the sides. Even in a frontal charge, these guys can do pretty damn good. However, you don't want to waste their abilities and their numbers on such frivolous attacks, because you'll end up wasting guys who you could have kept alive if you'd been a bit more smart with how you use them. As a general unit, they're fairly good too, because they're quite mobile, so you can get them out of range of enemy attacks, something that you can't necessarily do with other general units that Gondor can field, which are all dismounted. However, as a general unit, they are also kind of a bit vulnerable because they're mounted. While they can escape enemy infantry by running away as quickly as they can, no infantry unit can hope to match them. Archer volleys can do quite a bit of damage to these guys. Even though they are very well heavily armoured, they will succumb to concerted arrow fire, just like any other unit in the game will. They'll be able to handle it for quite a while, but archers can definitely kill them if you misuse these guys. Also spearmen and pikemen. If you charge these directly into spears and pikes, you're just going to waste your entire force. That's something you're going to want to try and avoid. But apart from that, they are absolutely amazing units. I would definitely bring them to any army I could get. So those are the Knights of the Silver Swan. Let's now look at the next unit in the faction roster, and that would be the first of their swordline units. Starting off with the Gondor Sword Militia. And Just by looking at these guys, you can automatically tell that they are lesser troops. In terms of their arms and armor, they do have a bit more uniformity than other militia units, and I quite like that. And that kind of speaks to Gondor's militarized state. Even though Gondor is a kingdom that's falling into ruin, even its least-most troops have some degree of uniformity, whereas other factions, their troops definitely don't have this. It doesn't make for much of a difference in the battle capabilities of the units, but on a visual basis, it's quite appealing to look at. So let's take a look at the equipment of these guys. To start off with, not all of them have helmets, and that's a big no-no. However, again, they are militia troops. That makes it a bit worse, because throughout history, while militia troops have made up large portions of armies, troops fighting in melee combat, for the most part, the first bit of armor that they would go to get, apart from shields, which are more equipment than armor, the first thing they try and grab are helmets, because helmets protect the most important part of your body, your head. So for a lot of these guys to have armor, and quite significant armor actually when you take a closer look at them, but not to have helmets is very weird. Some of them don't have helmets, which is a bit off, but many others do. And the helmets they have are the standard Gondorian Infantry helmet. And these are worn by most Gondorian line units, so they're professional troops. As I said before, these helmets are shaped very much like a medieval barbute, and that's kind of what they're based off. A cross between that and the helmets worn by Ottoman troops, especially their heavy cavalry, such as the Sipahi. Their helmets have the same rising point as these guys do, so it seems to be a bit of a fusion of both. Quite practical. I don't really have any issues with that. Well, they've got inlaid wings on their helmets. However, in this case, the inlaid wings aren't swans. They're seagulls, and that stands as a throwback to Gondor's foundation as a seafaring kingdom, going all the way back to Numenor, which itself was a seafaring empire. So it makes sense for them to have traditional markings on their helmets. Many helmets had engraved markings in them historically, so again, that's not ahistoric at all. Going down to their actual clothing and armor, they're all equipped with black surcoats with the symbol of the white tree, the symbol of the white tree being the symbol of Gondor, and that's what I mean when I say they're quite professional, in that all of them have this symbol. They've all got this surcoat, whereas other militia units for other factions would not have one single uniform, even if there are slight variations in how the troops look. The surcoat, that's very historical. Troops would often wear surcoats as a way of showing allegiance to their commanding officers, and also as a way of distinguishing on what side of a battlefield they were on. In terms of their arms and armor though, some of them have van braces on their arms, which was historically done. Many of them wear leather gloves, if not all of them. Gloves were also worn in battle too for protection for your hands. Underneath their surcoats, they seem to have mail coats on, or mail shirts, and that's quite good actually. That's a very high standard of protection for these troops. It doesn't equate to that in battle. These guys still get torn up fairly easily when facing off against determined foes. For guys who are all uniformly equipped with chainmail, you'd kind of expect that not to be the case, but I understand for balancing reasons that's why it is. However, that is quite good for a militia unit to all be wearing mail shirts, and that kind of speaks to what I was saying before about the helmets. You'd expect troops to have helmets far quicker than you'd expect them to all have mail shirts. Apart from that, all of the troops are equipped with round shields, all bearing the white tree of Gondor on them. And I was trying to remember where I'd seen these shields before, and then I remembered they're the same shield that Boromir uses in the Fellowship of the Ring. The round shields were most definitely used in history. Now, having the metal rim around the side, that's kind of ahistoric. There were round shields that were completely made of metal, such as bucklers. However, those were typically a bit smaller than these type of shields. However, having the central metal boss, that was done historically. Yeah, it's just the rim that's ahistoric as far as I can see, but round shields of this size were used in history. In terms of their weapon, each of the men is equipped with an arming sword. Looking at their arming swords, nothing seems in any way ahistoric. These all look like swords that you'd see being used in the Middle Ages. I can't find anything to fault there at all, except for the fact that they're a militia unit all equipped with swords, and that kinda isn't historic. While militia units would be given weapons, you'd expect them to be axes and mauls and spears and other hand weapons rather than swords, which were typically used by the more wealthier members of society, at least for some time in the Middle Ages. Near the end of the Middle Ages, swords were quite ubiquitous, with troops everywhere using them, not necessarily as their main weapon, more as a backup weapon. So, for example, longbowmen would aim to all be equipped with arming swords as well as their longbow. However, in this case I kind of give it a pass because Gondor's tradition in universe is for them to use heavily armoured swordsmen, so it makes sense that even their lower tier troops would be swordsmen to some degree. And because there are militia troops who use other weapons in the roster, I can kind of give these guys a blind eye. So now that we've looked at their arms and armour, let's try and find their commanding officer and see how he looks. And here is their commanding officer, and he's made the same cardinal sin as his troops. He doesn't have a helmet. Apart from that, he's covered in the standard Gondorian armour with plate head to toe. Yeah, he's got greaves, he's got armour covering the tops of his legs, he's got his breastplate inlaid with the Tree of Gondor, he's got his pauldrons, and he's got a cape on. Yes, he does have a cape on, so it looks quite nice. He's also got an arming sword as his main weapon, and he's got a shield that looks remarkably reminiscent of a Roman scutum in shape, also with the symbol of Gondor on it, I believe. Yes, it is. Looking at his shield, it looks to be a smaller version of a Roman scutum. It shares much the same shape, just on a smaller scale. And while I'm not too sure if that's historically accurate, I believe there probably would have been shields inspired by the scutum, but perhaps on a smaller scale. So I can kind of give that a pass. It's got the iron rims on the top and the bottom. That's also a bit iffy. But apart from that, shields of that general shape were used in history. His armour does look a bit more ornate than those worn by line Gondorian infantry, such as Standard Bearer, but apart from that, it's all very serviceable, except he doesn't have a helmet. Now, as for the role that these Gondorian sword militia play in battle, these guys will help make up the bulk of your really early armies. However, you're not going to want to use them long into the game because these guys don't do well against tier 2 orc units such as orc warriors. They will beat these guys hands down in hand-to-hand combat. Against tier 1 units, these guys can hold their ground quite well, such as orc rabble, but once you start putting them up against upper tiered units, they fall to the wayside really quickly. So use them, but always know that they're not going to be the core of your army. You're going to want to replace them as soon as possible. But they are good in battle in the early stages of the game, and even as the game goes on, if you have them as a reserve force to use for flanking attacks, they can do fairly alright in such a position. Just don't expect them to hold the line against really elite enemy units, because they're not made for that. Also, they've got large numbers, so they can somewhat absorb arrow fire from enemy units, although the morale is lower because they are a militia unit at the end of the day. So, these are the Gondorian sword militia. They're one of the building blocks of your armies. However, they're not the only sword units that Gondor has, thankfully for the faction, because Gondor can field quite a bit more than these guys. And one of the units that they can field, who are pretty much the upgraded version of these troops, are the Vinglo Veil men-at-arms. And just by looking at them, you can tell these guys are a step up from the Gondorian sword militia. For starters, they've all got head protection, and that automatically bumps them up a step. Now to begin with, what's the Vinglo Veil? The Vinglo Veil is one of the Gondorian fiefs, and these are the troops from the area that are levied as warriors for the Gondorian army. That'll come into play later on as we talk about these guys' role on the battlefield, but just keep that in mind that these are troops supplied from one fief of Gondor. These are all fairly well-equipped infantrymen. Now, not all of them necessarily have helmets, but they all do have head protection. Some, for example, have the standard Gondorian helmet. Others just have chainmail coifs, and they better hope for their sake that they've got padding underneath. Otherwise, when they get hit in the head, they're going to suffer incredibly gruesome head injuries. Some of them just have nasal helms or skull caps. Helmets such as these were used in the Middle Ages, more towards its beginning and middle rather than towards the late Middle Ages. However, in the High Middle Ages, such as for example during the Norman conquest of England, you would find helmets such as these in use. Now looking at their actual body armour, all of the troops have vambraces, they've all got gloves, they all have either Gambeson or leather armour. Now leather armour is a bit interesting when it comes to history. It did exist, but it wasn't necessarily as prevalent as people seem to think it was. One thing that I like about these troops' leather armour is that it has been sculpted. So for example, soldiers such as this man here, he has the white tree of Gondor sculpted onto his leather armour, and that's something that can be done with leather. You can sculpt it a lot more easily, whereas the other troops who are wearing Gambeson, they've had symbols of Gondor painted onto them, and that's something that can be more easily done with fabric armour and textile armour rather than with leather armour. Apart from that, their armor does look fairly good. Again, the leather armor, historically a bit iffy-ish, but it looks serviceable in these guys. Leather breastplate. Hopefully, it's a leather breastplate that's actually covering something. So, for example, there's metal inside the leather, so a bit more closer to a brigandine than anything else. But I don't really think it's going to be that in these guys' case. But apart from that, the others have Gambeson, which is far more historically accurate. Some of them have mail underneath their armor, and that's not really that accurate, because the fact is you'd rather have the metal on the outside with the Gambeson or the leather on the inside protecting you, rather than the other way around. So one provides padding and protection from enemy attacks, whereas the other one really wouldn't. So I find that a little bit strange. Apart from that, looking at their arms and shields, they've all got large heater shields, or perhaps these are cut down kite shields, and that is something that happened in history. As kite shields became less and less popular, the tops of them were cut off, so instead of having the curve at the top, they became more square at the top, or in a single line at the top. And then they gradually shrunk in size until they became the heater shields that we were talking about before. So that might be the same thing here, that these are cut down kite shields. If so, they do look quite historically accurate, except for the metal rim around the side. Historically, shields did not have metal rims around the side at all. It's an inaccuracy that people seem to believe quite a lot. It did not happen. You would have shields that were completely metal, or were covered in thin metal over the top, such as, for example, ancient Greek hoplite shields, but you would not have shields with metal rims all around the side. That is historically inaccurate. Looking at these men's arming swords, they all look quite historically accurate. They look like weapons that you'd see in common service in the Middle Ages, so I can't really find any reason to fault their swords. Their commanding officer wears the same leather breastplate as the rest of his troops, or some of his troops, which we spoke about before. He has leather pauldrons on. Those are historically inaccurate. As far as I know, leather pauldrons are not a real thing. He has the same shield as his men, and he has the same sword as his men. Apart from that, his equipment is much the same. So, yeah, he's also committed the same sin of not wearing a helmet either, which, I mean, if you want to advertise to the enemy to target you, because you're not wearing a helmet and you're an easy target, feel free to, but that is historically inaccurate. Especially for commanders, they try and make sure to protect themselves, because they were valuable targets on the battlefield. As for the Vinglo Veil men-at-arms role on the battlefield, as I was saying before, these are levy troops from only one region in Gondor, and as a result you can only have limited numbers of them in an army, meaning these guys cannot be the bulk of your sword infantry in your army. Keeping in mind that with these limits on their numbers you can't use them to be the bulk of your army, what you can do with them is use them to supplant your Gondorian sword militia, so that you have stronger units taking their place in your army, up until you can replace them with the standard line Gondorian Infantry, who are far better than any of the other sword units that Gondor can bring to the table, including the Vinglo Veil men-at-arms. Or you can use these guys as supplementary units to a Gondorian army composed of Gondorian line infantry, like the ones I was just talking about. If so, you can have these guys in the back as a flanking force, or use them to plug up gaps in your battle line. So they do have their useful roles. However, what they fail to do because of their numbers is be the core of your army. That's one role that these guys cannot fulfill. Apart from that, they are very good units as far as I'm concerned. They can go toe-to-toe with most tier 2 units fairly well. Orc Infantry, such as the Orc Warriors, who are tier 2 units, they don't really stand a chance against these guys. They will fall to them in a one-on-one battle. Vinglo Veil men-at-arms. Very good unit for what it is, but there are better that Gondor can bring to the battlefield. And it's those troops that are better that we're going to be looking at. Starting off with, arguably the epitome of the Gondorian infantry line. And the thing that you automatically think of when you hear the words Gondor or Gondorian army are these guys. The Gondorian sword infantry. And what an amazing looking unit they are. And I'm just going to be honest, it's because the Gondorian faction roster has these guys that Gondor is probably my favourite faction in the game. You can thank these guys for that, or you can blame them for that if you wanted me to support other factions more than these guys. But yeah, I absolutely love Gondor, and I more than anything love Gondor's line infantry, starting with the Gondorian sword infantry. So just looking at these guys, you can tell automatically They're very heavily armoured. They have the same helmets as we were talking about before that the other Gondorian troops have, so we're not going to go into detail apart from to say they're historically plausible. As for their body armour, they've got breastplates made of steel, they've got pauldrons made of steel, they've got van braces made of steel, they've got gloves, they have armoured boots, they have greaves, and they have folds defending their upper parts of their legs. Underneath their breastplates, they've also got what I'm assuming is a chainmail shirt, and that is also historically plausible. Looking at it from a historical standpoint, when you have troops who wear plate armor from head to toe, they normally wouldn't wear mail underneath their armor because they consider it overkill. Generally, they'd either wear a gambeson or some type of arming doublet, or sometimes just silken clothes underneath to provide more protection or to be more comfortable in their armor. However, it is also known that in history there were some regions in which troops did wear mail underneath plate, giving them even more protection from enemy attacks, such as Italy. So, in this case, I feel it wrong to say that these troops are inaccurately armoured, because it is in fact historically plausible for troops to be armoured as such. Now that we've looked at their armour, let's look at their weapons and their shield. And this is where the unit becomes a little bit iffy from a historical standpoint. So going back to what I said about the Knights of the Silver Swan, when troops become so heavily armoured, they don't really require shields to defend themselves anymore. Instead, what they're free to do is discard the shield and start using two-handed weapons, such as, for example, pole hammers, pole axes, other weapons such as that. Weapons that can do a lot more damage to enemy forces than just arming swords. However, as you can see just by looking at the unit, they're all equipped with arming swords and the same type of Stutum-esque shield. Now, it is true that there were some troops who did continue to use shields as infantry, even while heavily armoured. That is plausible, as is the fact that they're carrying arming swords, because arming swords did continue to be used throughout the Middle Ages. It is true that they were superseded by other types of weapons as the years went on. However, they didn't fade into obscurity entirely. They were still used. What's implausible is that whole units of an army have chosen to continue to be equipped as such. Historically, it'd be on a more one-to-one basis that you'd have troops choosing to equip themselves as such, rather than choosing to wield double-handed weapons and getting rid of their shields. So, as I said before with the arming swords, they are all historically plausible, or historically accurate. I don't find any issues with these. As for their commanding officer, he should be in the front lines with his men, and he too is also missing a helmet, which I'm always going to bring up whenever it's time to bring it up. He is equipped exactly the same as the militia officer, so I'm not going to go into detail on him. As for these guys all on the battlefield, Gondor Sword Infantry will make up the bulk of your sword infantry pretty much. You want as many of these guys in your army as possible, or at least within a balanced army. You don't want to make an army entirely these guys do not have archers or cavalry, but as a solid core of infantry, they are very, very good. They're Gondor's premier infantry units, and they should be respected as such. Having armies with these guys is absolutely the way to go when building an army as Gondor. Against enemy units such as orcs, these guys will do great. Even the tier 3 units of enemies such as Mordor, such as their orcs, even those guys can't go toe-to-toe with these tier 3 units on a one-on-one basis. They will fall against them. And that's the enemy's upper tier troops at that. So these guys really are very, very useful, and should most definitely be used whenever possible if you're playing as Gondor. Having looked at these guys, we have exhausted all of Gondor's sword infantry units. However, the sword infantry isn't the only thing Gondor brings to the table, for Gondor does have other troops, and the other troops are pretty damn impressive to look at too. So let's start by looking at some of them, beginning with Gondor's shock units. And what shock units they are: the Warriors of Lossarnach. Now, just to begin with, Lossarnach is another one of Gondor's fiefs, so the same restriction goes to these guys as I said for the other fief units. You can't have too many of them in an army. In these guys' case, you really wouldn't want to have too many of them in an army because they are shock troops. Having armies comprised entirely of shock troops, in my opinion, is a bit of a bad idea. I don't know about other players, but that's just how I see it. Looking at these guys, you can tell that they're shock units because to begin with, they're all armed with two-handed weapons. These large axes. And axes such as these were very much used historically, and I like to see that they're using axes in this shape, rather than the more fantastical axes used by troops from Erebor, for example. So the dwarven axes, those are very much unhistorical axes and very much fantasy-oriented weapons, whereas these would not look out of place being wielded by a Huskarl in Saxon England, or by a Norman warrior, or by a Viking raider. Weapons like these were quite ubiquitous during the early Middle Ages. Looking at the shields on these guys' backs, they're the same shields as those used by the Gondorian Sword Militia. This kind of stands to what I was saying before about having standardization of equipment for units. So the fact that these guys are using such shields kind of tells you that they're lowered down in terms of quality in Gondor's armies. And that's true. These guys, I believe, are tier 2 units. So while they are fairly well-equipped shock infantry, they're really no match for the shock infantry wielded by other factions, such as, for example, the Easterlings and their tier 3 units. Those would tear these guys apart in battle. But then again, the goal isn't to use shock infantry against shock infantry in a head-to-head battle. You want to use them to pierce weak points in enemy lines and cause breakthroughs. And these guys most definitely can do that, especially against orcs and the Haradrim. Against orc infantry, these guys will tear a hole through them, especially when attacking from the rear or sides. Absolutely devastating. Looking at the equipment that these troops have, they all have chainmail hauberks covering themselves. They don't really have van braces, they don't have gloves, but the mail, which is often covered in a surcoat bearing the symbol of the Lossarnach Veil, I quite like that. That again is very historically accurate for troops to cover themselves in surcoats, like I said before. The hauberks, entirely historically accurate. Now, many of them just have mail coifs. In regards to their helmets, some of them wear helmets that would not look out of place in the 11th century and 10th centuries. So these skull caps look quite historically accurate. I don't really find an issue with them. Some of them have aventails, or they've just been put on top of mail coifs, and that was done historically, so I can't find anything wrong there. If you can, please let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear it. Now, as I was saying before about these guys all on the battlefield, they're very useful units. They're not as useful as other units that other factions can field, but for Gondor, they do their role well. You don't want too many of them in your army, and you can't have too many of them in your army, but when used the right way, they can be very devastating. And let's look for their commanding officer, and here he is. I'm assuming this man is the commanding officer, and he does not look much different from the rest of his troops. He's a little bit different. He has armoured sleeves. Now, instead of having a hauberk that ends at the elbow, his goes all the way up to his hands. And again, very historical. You would find armour like that being used quite a lot throughout medieval Europe and North Africa and the Middle East. So, nothing to critique there. So, having looked at the warriors of Lossarnach, we've covered all of Gondor's shock infantry. However, these are not the only axe infantry that Gondor can bring to the battlefield, for Gondor does have other axemen in its roster. However, they're not quite as good as these guys, as you'll see. We will now move on to the Hillmen of Lamidon. And just by looking at these guys, you can tell automatically that they're a militia unit, and that doesn't really surprise you at all, does it? So, Lamidon is another fief of Gondor, so the same restriction goes for these guys as for the other fiefdom units. You can't bring too many of them into your army. However, in these guys' case, you really wouldn't want to bring them to your army or make them the bulk of your army. These guys are very much meant to be used in the early stages of the game. You really want to phase them out as quickly as possible. For example, replacing them with the warriors of Lossarnach. But before we properly get to that, let's just look at these guys' armor, or rather lack of armor, and their weapons. So to begin with, not all of them have helmets. We spoke about that before. However, in these guys' case, it's a bit more plausible, because almost none of them have body armor at all. They're just wearing their regular clothing and coats. So the fact that some of them just have shields and axe and no helmet, that is historically accurate. If they had mail coats protecting them, then it would be very much out of place. But for the way they're shown, it's historically accurate. Now, in terms of shields, they've got a mix. Some of them have the heater shields that we spoke about before, and the same round shields. We're not going to talk about their shields because the same points about their shields stand. Moving on to their weapons, they're all equipped with small axes and hatchets, and these weapons were very commonly used in the Middle Ages, both because axes were very easy to find, but also because axes are very cheap. You can just grab an axe that you use for working in your house or working on your farm, and it can quickly be pressed into service against the enemy. It won't be as good as a proper made battle axe, but it will do its role in a pinch. And that's what these guys are. They're very much a rough scratch militia who have grabbed whatever arms they could find. However, while many of them do not wear armor, I forgot to say, some of them do wear the same skull caps that we spoke about before, so my same point for them goes too. Now, let's try and find these guys' commanding officer and see if he stands out from his troops. And their commanding officer does stand out, and he too is also missing a helmet, which we spoke about before, not historic at all. He's got the same leather breastplate and the same pauldrons, we spoke about those before, and unlike his men, instead of axes, he uses an arming sword, which is historically accurate, so they need to go back into it. Now, touching on what these guys' role on the battlefield is, you put them in your early army, and you get rid of them in your early army. You don't want to keep them, you can't really use them as the core of your army, nor would you want to, so they're very much there just to be gotten rid of. They fill up spots in your army. At best, they can take archer fire from enemies, and they can suffer the casualties while your better quality troops survive to fight, but that's really all they can do. That and flanking attacks against weaker infantry, because they have the axe, they are kind of shock infantry to a lesser degree, so if you attack Orc Band from behind while you've got sword militia facing them from the front, you can break them with these troops, but they're not really that useful on the battlefield when you look at it as a whole. These are the men of Lamidon. They're not very useful, but they do have somewhat of a role in your army. And you can't help but kind of feel endeared towards them because they are just regular guys who have been picked up and put onto the battlefield. They do their best. And well, what else can we hope of them? If they can do their best, so can we. However, these aren't the best troops that Gondor can bring to the battlefield, and Gondor does have many more troops to look at, including what I believe is next, their spear line. And we'll start off with Gondor's first spear unit, the Gondorian Spearminer. Now, as I said before, we're not going to go into detail about previous things that I've noted. So, for example, these guys have the same helmets, lack of helmets, the same surcoats, the same shields, the same mail underneath their surcoats. However, they've all been equipped with spears rather than swords. And again, the military standardization of Gondor comes into play here, because they're all using spears that are reminiscent of a Japanese yari. Given we don't need to really talk about their arms or armor that much, let's find their commanding officer. He is equipped much the same as the other militia officer, lack of helmet again, so we're not going to go into detail with him. What we will talk about is these guys all on the battlefield. To begin with, these guys are more historically plausible as a Gondorian militia unit, because historically your militia units would almost always be spearmen or archers. Sometimes maybe axemen, but swordsmen very, very rarely. So for these guys to all be equipped with spears is very historical. Them having the standardized spears isn't, however, because this is Gondor that we're talking about, it makes sense that they all have the same type of spear. As for these guys all on the battlefield, they're also an integral part of your early army, building up the bulk of your spear line. Now, while they do have a critical role in your early army, you don't want to continue to use them for the whole of the game. They're useful, but they do have their weaknesses. They will hold the line against early enemy units, but as with all things, they will be outclassed the longer the game goes on. So you do want to replace them with other units. That said, as garrison units, they serve a role fairly well, and they can be somewhat useful for filling in the gaps later on you go in the game if you're running low on money. Just to chuck in a couple of these guys as an extra reserve force. Good units, they too do their role well, but there are other units in the Gondorian roster that do a better role. Looking at the next unit in Gondor's spear line, the Galen Spearman. The men of Galen hail from the fief of Galen, which means that you cannot have many of these units in your army, so they will not be your main spear line. Just looking at their equipment, these men all have the exact same spears, so we're not going to go into that. They all have the same shield, the same cut down kite shield, again with the symbol of the white tree on it. We're not going to go into the details of that. Something that these guys have that makes them a step above the Gondorian Spear Militia is that every one of these warriors has helmets. And again, for the most part, if not all of them, they're the exact same skull cap helmets I was talking about before, the nasal helms. No need to go into detail. Again, they've also got either the mail aventails attached, or they're just wearing mail coifs underneath. historically accurate. In addition to their helmets, all of them also wear green gambesons covered with the white tree of Gondor. Gambeson is a very historically accurate bit of armor, and I like that you get to see troops use it in-game, because it's often quite overlooked in video games and in movies and TV shows, so to see Gambeson being used here, it's quite a fun thing. Underneath the Gambeson, they have mail, and again, it's the same thing I was talking about before with the other units that had mail underneath their armor. It doesn't really make sense. You put the padded armor underneath the mail, not over the mail. That's about it for the troops' equipment. Their commanding officer will probably not have a helmet, or will he? No, he does have a helmet, and the commanding officer of the Galen Spearman, he breaks the mold. He wears a helmet, much like the rest of his men. So I believe he has mail, and then over the mail, he has leather, or he's got a gambeson. I can't really properly tell. So that may or may not be historical, depending on what he's got. The leather pauldrons, that's most definitely not historical. And he also has steel van braces covering his forearms, and those are historical. So he's a bit of a weird mix of historical and ahistorical. I quite like the design of the commanding officer and his unit, because just by looking at him you can tell these are troops that are somewhat professional, but they're definitely not your standard line infantry. As for their role on the battlefield, these guys should be used to replace the spear militia to a degree, but again, you can't use these guys to be the bulk of your spear line. Instead, you replace some of the spearmen with this, or you wait to build up your standard Gondorian line infantry. Or instead, once you have an army composed of Gondorian line infantry, you get these guys as reserve units to fill up gaps in the line, or to serve as a second row of defense, because they can be pressed into service fairly well against enemies, such as cavalry, or even against enemy spearmen and swordsmen. They can do their role fairly well, and they do quite good against archers. So now that we've looked at these guys all on the battlefield, we'll move on to their superiors. And now we move on to their superiors, the Gondorian Spear Infantry. And again, they are yet another amazing looking Gondorian infantry covered in plate from head to toe. So we're going to skip over the things that we said before. They have the same armor, they have the same shield, they have the same helmet. They also have the same spears used by the other spear units instead of the swords. It looks like a Yari. It makes sense for a standardized army. Troops this heavy probably should be using polearms or maybe pikes instead of that. Instead of the sword units, these guys wield the Yari looking spears. Let's find their commanding officer. Here he is. He's equipped much the same, missing his helmet again. Not going to go into details on him. As for these guys all on the battlefield, these should be the bulk of your spear line. They're very good spearmen, amongst the best in the game. The thing you want to do with these guys is replace all of your Gondorian Spear militia with them as quickly as possible, as well as your Galen Spearmen, although the Galen Spearmen are quite a bit of a step up from the Militia Spearmen. These guys will hold the line against the hordes of enemy, be they Easterlings, Haradrim, Mordor's troops, so for example the Orcs, or even against other human enemies who you wouldn't expect, such as for example the Rohirrim or such. It would absolutely be a mistake to avoid filling your army with these guys. And the one spear unit that surpasses the Spear Infantry of Gondor are the Citadel Guard. Now these guys are another general unit that Gondor can field, much like the Knights of the Silver Swan. So that kind of tells you how rare and expensive and good these troops are when they're a general unit for the faction. They are equipped with much the same spears as the other spearmen. They have different shields, which I really do like. They look quite amazing, with the nice blue enameling with the gold inlay over the top, showing the citadel, which is Minas Tirith, which these guys protect, as well as the White Tree of Gondor, showing the city which they guard, as well as the kingdom which they guard. So quite a nice ensemble for their shields. Shields of that shape are historical. Shields of this shape were used historically. The type of shield that jumps to mind the most when I look at these are Pavise Shields or Pavise Shields. Large shields used by infantry in the late Middle Ages, particularly by crossbowmen, but also by other infantry as well. So I can't fault these shields on their historical accuracy. In terms of the armor that the men wear, their armor is just the Gondorian Spear Infantry armor, but more ornate. So for example, their helmets have separate seagull wings rather than the inlaid wings carved in that the other troops have. Their helmets also have inlaid gold, which helps set them apart as an elite unit, and that was done historically. troops having inlaid armor with gold and gems and the like put in to show off the wealth of the user and their elite status. So that completely makes sense. Their body armor is the same, so we're not really going to look at their body armor. It's the Gondorian Spear line infantry armor. And their commanding officer, if this is their commanding officer, and yes it is, he doesn't really look any different from the rest of his troops. Maybe his armor's slightly more ornate, and he also wields a spear like the rest of his men. So their commanding officer isn't much different from them, except he too is smart enough to wear a helmet, which we do like to see. What does these guys role on the battlefield? They can either be a general unit, which they do quite well at, or they can be a linchpin of your spear line. These guys will hold the line against just about anything, even when they're attacked from all four sides. Eventually they will crumble, like all units, when faced with endless enemy attacks. But these guys will do great wonders on the battlefield. They can hold the line for ages, especially if you've only got them facing one line of enemies in one direction. They can withstand countless volleys from enemy archers too, so they're quite defendable against enemy ranged units should the enemy attempt to snipe them. Their only weakness being that as spear units they are slow, so moving them around the battlefield to where you need them can be a bit of a hassle. Also, because they're slow, they're vulnerable to being sniped by enemy artillery too, especially if you make them your general unit. But apart from that, these guys are absolutely great. However, because they're so expensive and also limited, there's no way in hell you can make an army made out of these guys. But nonetheless, the Citadel Guard of Gondor, you'd be mad not to include them in your army if you had a chance to include them in your army, as far as I'm concerned. They make any army that much better with their inclusion. So now that we've looked at the Citadel Guards, we've completed Gondor's spear line, and what a spear line is, just as strong as its sword line, if not stronger. However, Gondor doesn't just have spears and swords, it also has its polearm units too, and we'll start by looking at one of those, the Prince's Coast Guard, and what a unit these guys are as well. So to begin with, these men all come from Dol Amroth, so these are yet another fiefdom unit. And as I said before, Dol Amroth does have infantry as well as cavalry, and these are the infantry contingent that it brings to the battlefield. These guys, again, they're limited in numbers, but polearms shouldn't really be the bulk of your army, they're more of an accessory to your army. However, that may change depending on your personal taste when constructing armies, but for me, I rather use them as support units than as your standard line infantry. Looking at these guys on the battlefield, they're equipped with large pole weapons, or in this case what I'm assuming would be large halberds. Their weapons have the large spike spear tips for being used as a spear. They have the large axe head on one side for hacking down against enemies, and they have the hook on the back for dragging down enemy cavalrymen. So knock a rider off of his horse and then dispatch him with the spear point or the axe blade. Very versatile weapons, massively used during the Middle Ages, especially as the period went on, to the point that in the late Middle Ages, massive portions of armies were comprised entirely of pole-armed units. So, very historical for these guys to be in the game. In terms of their shields, they have no shields, and again, that is historically accurate too. Generally, when you were using massive two-handed weapons, you wouldn't have shields. Now, there are some paintings of halberdiers being equipped with shields. However, in general, such imagery is quite rare and suggests that halberdiers with shields were also quite a rarity on the battlefield. In terms of their body armor, they've all got a surcoat covered in the white swan of Dol Amroth, which makes sense. They've all got helmets, all again which look like medieval barbutes. So the helmets worn by the Prince's Coast Guard do look remarkably similar to those used by Gondorian infantry in general. However, there are some differences. For starters, these helmets are a bit taller than those, and these helmets do also have a bit more of a defined brow, making them look more reminiscent of Ottoman helmets more than anything else, especially with that kind of acorn shape that they've got. What I can kind of fault them for is the fact that their gorget is going over their surcoat, and the gorget is the armoured plate around the neck, designed to prevent attacks from reaching the throat and killing the soldier. Normally you'd wear that under your armour, as a way of giving yourself an extra layer of defense rather than over the top of your armour. That's something that's done quite a lot in Game of Thrones, and it is very historically inaccurate to do such. Let's look for their commanding officer, and I'm assuming this is their commanding officer. He has a shield covered with the white Swan of Dol Amroth, and he also uses the same arming sword as the Swan Knight officer does. His helmet is similarly ornate, so with the giant wings. He has plate armor protecting his body with mail underneath, and underneath his armor he has very ornate robes, which these other troops do not have, as a way of differentiating him from his infantry. Still a pretty cool looking officer, and because he does wear the helmet, he does score above many of the other officers who chose to discard their helmets for suicidal reasons. A cool looking officer for a cool looking unit. Now, as for what the Prince's Coast Guards do, these guys are halberdiers, so you should kind of use them in a reserve, using to hack down and slash enemy cavalry where it attacks. If they raid your spear line, throw these guys into the mix and they'll carve them up. The two big weaknesses that these guys have is that while they are great against enemy cavalry when the cavalry is stuck into another unit, or when these guys are attacking the cavalry if the enemy isn't using the cavalry properly, being charged by cavalry is a death sentence for this unit. Even if it's from the front, enemy cavalry will run ruin on these guys, and the unit will break really easily. They're just not built to handle shock cavalry. On the other hand, while these guys are great at tearing up enemy infantry in head-to-head battle, or more so in flanking attacks or attacks from the rear, these guys destroy enemy units in battle. They're quite vulnerable to archers because they are lacking shields, so you have to be careful to try and avoid them from being worn out by enemy archer fire, because such a unit is quite a good target to go after if you've got archers. Even with those weaknesses in mind, this is quite a good unit, and it's a nice way of showing the strength that Dol Amroth contributes to Gondor, both in terms of cavalry and infantry. However, that said, these are the only halberdiers that Gondor can bring to the battlefield. It has no other polearm units. Or at least no other polearm units that fight like this, for it does have another unit which does use large spear weapons. Moving on from the Prince's Coast Guards, we come to another one of Gondor's general units, that being the Fountain Guards. And just by looking at them, you can tell what type of polearm unit they are. They're a pike unit, and unfortunately for Gondor, it's its only pike unit, and because they are a general unit, they're very expensive to bring to the battlefield. They're immensely effective, but that is a bit of a problem that they have. But we'll put that to the side until we look at their role on the battlefield. For starters, looking at their weapons and shields, they don't have any shields because they're pike units, although in history, pike units did occasionally have shields, such as, for example, Alexander the Great's phalangites. They had smaller shields than those used by the traditional Greek hoplites, but they did have shields nonetheless. These guys do not, but that again was also done quite a lot in history. In terms of their pikes are pretty much massive elongated spears, which all pikes are, but these are the same spears wielded by the rest of the faction, except they have these winglets on the side, or wingets on the side, or langlets on the side. I'm not too sure what the term for this is. These were used on spears to prevent animals or prey from sliding down the spear blade when stabbed. However, on pikes, not so much. I haven't really heard about pikes having these attachments. More so, the type of weapon that this pike is quite wrong, because historically, because the pike is a very large, long weapon, you want to try and make the weapon at the tip of the pike as small as possible, so a really small spike, so that you have as little weight on the end of a really long lever. Instead, by putting this massive sword blade spear tip at the edge of the pike, you've now given the pike an immensely heavy spear tip, and that kind of ruins the whole point of the pike if the pike's so heavy that it's going to break in half or bend over in half. So that is very much historically inaccurate. When you make pikes, you want a small tip on the end. It looks cool, and it also helps tie in, again, with Gondor's standardization of equipment, but it is very much wrong. As for the equipment that the troops themselves have, they're very heavily armored. Their helmets are, again, the same type of helmets as those used by the Gondorian line infantry, except more ornate, with larger cheek guards, large nasal bar, and they've also got the big white wings of the seagull on the side. And as I said before, such attachments on helmets were done historically, such as by the Teutonic Order. However, the historical use of these on the battlefield is up for debate. In terms of their body armor, they have breastplates, they also have vambraces, they have pauldrons, they have mail underneath, then covering their legs, they have large, what I'm assuming are robes, but they might be reinforced. So for example, then covering their legs are what I'm assuming is close to a buff coat, so very thick, heavy leather that's difficult to cut through, that was used later than the Middle Ages. So for example, in the 17th century, you have soldiers using buff coats. I'm assuming that's what it is, covering their legs, or just robes over mail, which was done historically. So that's what the regular Fountain Guard warriors look like. Taking a look at the front lines of the Fountain Guard, it seems that the unit doesn't have an officer who is distinct from his troops, so we'll have to assume that he blends in with the rest of his soldiers, at least as far as I can tell, because I can't see any officer there. Now, as for the unit's role on the battlefield, they are pikemen, as you can very clearly tell, so they're immensely useful against enemy cavalry forces, especially against the Easterlings, who tend to use cavalry more so than other dark forces. But against cavalry, these guys are absolutely great. The problem is, because they're such elite units, you can only bring a handful of them to the battlefield. That kind of weakens their impact. If you can only have one pike unit here or there, that kind of destroys any chance of building a large pike army. But it would be cool for Gondor to have had another pike unit. Maybe a very weak one, but one that could kind of fulfill the role of having a pike unit in the army, with these guys being ultra elite pikes that you could get at your discretion, rather than if you want pikes you have to buy this extremely expensive unit. That said, they're very useful not just against enemy cavalry, but against enemy infantry too. These guys will tear them apart. One weakness that these guys have, however, apart from being hit by the rear, which is a weakness that all pike units have, is archers. While they are heavily armoured against enemy bowmen and slingers and the like, or enemy artillery, they are at a disadvantage. And if you make these guys your general unit, that's more so of a weakness, because it means your general is much more liable to be shot apart by enemies. Whereas if your general was a Citadel Guard or a Knight of the Silver Swan, they'd be far more protected against enemy archers, either by their heavy armour and shields, or by their mounts and the ability to run away out of enemy range. So that's one weakness that this unit has. That said, it's still a very good unit, and I'd use them any time that I could, but they do have their distinct downsides. Now that we've looked at the Fountain Guard, we've actually looked at all of Gondor's standard infantry, so it's time to move on to Gondor's ranged units, starting with the Gondorian Bow Militia. And what I said about the other Gondorian militia units goes for these guys, so the same thing about helmets and armour. The one big difference, or rather two big differences that these guys have, is that they don't have shields, and instead they use what I'm assuming are short bows. As early archers, these guys are very useful as the building blocks of your army. However, while these guys are amongst the first archers that Gondor has in its roster, they are in fact quite useful against the enemy, just because they provide Gondor's army with the ability to fight the enemy at a ranged distance. So they're useful in that manner. Also, because they're a large unit due to their low ranking status as a militia unit, it means that there's more troops in the battlefield who can fire bows at the enemy, as well as who can absorb arrow fire from the enemy too. So that is something that the unit has going for it. However, the unit does also have its downsides. Because it is a militia unit at the end of the day, it means that their quality as archers is rather low, meaning they're not very accurate. The damage that they deal out to the enemy isn't that accurate either, due to the quality of their bows. And if they're reached by enemy infantry in hand-to-hand combat, they will perish very quickly. You do not want to use these guys in melee battle at all. Maybe you could kind of spare them as a flanking force once they've run out of arrows, and you don't really have anything else to do with them. You could try attacking enemy infantry from the back, but even then, these guys aren't really that useful in melee combat. Just keep that in mind. They're not a unit that can do double duty as infantry and as archers. They're very much archers, and they're not the best of the bunch. But they'll do their job in thinning enemy forces early on in the game. You don't want to keep them forever though, because there are better archers that the faction can field. Now, looking for the commanding officer, here he is, and he's equipped just the same as the other officers we spoke about before, with no helmet. So there's no reason to really talk about him anymore. Now, while these are the first archers that Gondor can field, the faction does have many other archers, including the better Vinglo Veil archers, and these guys are a definite step up from the archer militia. So for starters, All of these men have larger bows. I believe all these guys use long bows rather than the same hunting bows or short bows that the Gondorian bow militia were using. Now, not all of them have helmets, which again is a big weakness. However, they do have more body armor, I believe. So all of them have mail underneath their surcoats, which is quite good to see. And that kind of makes them closer in line to the retinue archers used during the 14th and 15th centuries. They're also all equipped with a short sword as a backup weapon, whereas the Gondorian bow militia, who we looked at before, they only had daggers to defend themselves with. These guys aren't great at melee combat, but they can do better than the militia can. The Blackroot Veil is another fiefdom in Gondor, meaning that, as with the other fief units, you cannot bring many of these to your army. At most 3, I believe. These guys are definitely useful for phasing out the Gondorian bow militia, however you won't be able to completely replace them. Once you replace all of your archers with Gondor's line archers, so the next unit we're going to look at after these guys, these troops do make a good supplementary force to beef up your archer force if you have extra money. They're never really going to be the core of your archer force. Let's now look at their actual equipment, or at least the pieces of equipment we neglected to look at. We did say they didn't have helmets, and that is true. However, some of them do have helmets, and they're quite fascinating looking helmets. Looking at them, they remind me very much of the helmets that you see worn early on in the Fellowship of the Ring during the prologue scene with the Battle of the Last Alliance, because you do see Gondorian/Arnorian infantry going into battle using these helmets, so it's kind of a way of showing that their levy troops, the equipment that they bring to battle isn't the best, so they're forced to use older equipment, such as, say, ancient helmets from long ago wars. So I do like that. The helmets remind me of those worn by Roman infantry, in particular the Roman legionaries, especially those in service during the turn of BC to AD, around that period. Now that we've looked at the troops' arms and armor, let's try and find the commanding officer, and let's see if he stands out from the group. And yes, he does. So their commanding officer doesn't have a helmet, which is a bit of a disappointment. He does have leather pauldrons, which aren't historical. Underneath the pauldrons, he has a mail coat, which was historically used, so points for that. He has a surcoat with the inlaid silver tree of Gondor over it, which kind of shows off the fact that he is an officer of the unit compared to his other troops, who just have painted on or sewn on white trees of Gondor, as well as his arming sword. He doesn't have a shield, and does he have a bow? I believe the commanding officer does also have a bow, because he has a sheath of arrows at his side. Also, one other thing going for these guys historically is the fact that their arrows are on their side rather than on their back, because I believe that having arrows on your back wasn't actually a very historically accurate thing. So that is something that goes for these guys in their favour. So these are the Blackroot Archers. They're useful, most definitely, but they'll never be the core of your archer force. However, luckily for you, there are troops who will be the core of your archer force. And the troops who will be the bulk of your archer force are the Gondor Archers. We're not going to go into the details of their armour. They're just as heavily armoured as Gondor's other line infantry. They've all got what I'm assuming are arming swords too. Nice to see that. And they've all got longbows. And their commanding officer is also equipped the same as the other officers, missing a helmet. Now, going back to the actual unit itself, what its role on the battlefield is that it's the core archer force that Gondor fields. You want to make up as many of your archers of this unit rather than anything else, because they are very heavily armoured, and they do fairly well in battle against the enemy as archers. Are they as good as the archers wielded by archer civilizations and archer factions such as the elves? No. But, then again, they're not elves, they're humans. They may not be the match of even the humans of Dale, but they are still very good archers. They can take a lot of punishment, and they can deal out a lot of punishment too. So they're definitely very useful. You want these guys being the bulk of your line, that's for sure. Now, apart from their capabilities in exchanges of arrows, these guys are also very useful in hand-to-hand combat, because once they run out of arrows, you can use them as sword infantry. Now, on the front lines, that's a bit iffy, especially if you're facing off against high-tier enemy infantry. However, for flanking forces and rear attacks, especially against lesser infantry, these guys really do the job well. They can definitely punch a hole in enemy lines if you use them smartly. Definitely a unit that you want to include in your army as much as possible and as quickly as possible, because they really are a great unit to field. Well, the Gondor Archers are very good archers. They're not the only archers that Gondor can field, for Gondor has another archer unit that's even more elite, and those are the Ithilien Rangers. Now, Ithilien is another fiefdom of Gondor, however it's a bit separate from the others in that it's no longer under Gondor's direct territory. Ithilien is the region between Gondor and Mordor, and while for thousands of years it had been under Gondorian control, it gradually fell under the influence of Mordor and was ceded as the strength of Mordor grew too strong. So many of the warriors who lived in that region have now instead turned to guerrilla warfare to fight against the Dark Lord, striking at his convoys and trying to weaken him rather than fighting him head-on in massive battles, which Gondor can't afford to do as of now. So these troops provide a very valuable service for Gondor, gathering information on what Sauron and his forces plan, as well as weakening them, even if only by a bit, because you need to weaken the enemy by any means possible. As such, because they are a stealth unit, you can tell they do not have armor, and that very much makes sense. They're a stealth unit, you don't expect them to be walking around in plate. And none of these troops have helmets. Many of them just have capes or cloaks, which makes sense. In terms of bows, they all have longbows, and they're all very, very skilled with the longbows. These are the best archers that the faction can field after all. They're also very good in hand-to-hand combat with their arming swords too. Now, the problem that this unit faces is against enemy archers, because while they can knock out enemy archers fairly well due to the quality of the unit, absorbing arrow fire is not something that these troops can do very well, due to the lack of armor that they all have. So you want to be careful if you use these guys in exchanges of arrow fire. What these guys can do though is ambush enemy troops, which is one of their special abilities. They have stealth, so you can set them ahead of your line as a way to attack the enemy early. Now, looking at the rest of their armor, many of them have leather coats, leather gloves, boots, tunics, coats, cloaks, nothing special. I can't really say that's ahistorical or historical. It's not really battlefield clothing, but then again, it's not really meant to be battlefield clothing. These are special forces, they're not meant to fight the enemy toe-to-toe, so it makes sense that they're equipped as such. Their commanding officer is equipped much the same as the rest of his men, except he does not have a bow. Instead, he has his arming sword / longsword? Yeah, possibly a longsword. He has a surcoat, also fabric with the White Tree of Gondor on it, and that's about it. Not much to talk about for this unit. Hopefully, when more hero units are added to the faction, Faramir becomes one of the heroes, because then you can give him his own ranger unit. And that'd be pretty cool to see as far as I'm concerned. This is the last of the archers that Gondor can field. Definitely very useful, but they will not be the bulk of your archer line by any means. But still, use them in battle if you can. They're definitely a great addition to any Gondorian army. Apart from the archers though, Gondor does have other ranged units, starting with the Anfalas coast levies. Just by looking at these guys, you can kind of tell what they are. They're peasants. They have no armor whatsoever, no helmets whatsoever, which makes sense. They've got javelins, and that's about it. They've also got the same round shields, which we spoke about before. The javelins make sense, and javelins were very often used in medieval warfare, especially by lower tier troops such as these conscripted peasants, pretty much, even more so than the Gondorian sword militia. The commanding officer looks like a militiaman himself. He has no armor except for a leather pauldron and a leather gorget, which was not used historically as far as I know, both for the pauldron or the gorget. He does have a helmet though, so he has the same skull cap nasal helm that the other troops have. When your commanding officer looks like a peasant himself, it doesn't inspire much confidence in the rest of the unit. But again, that's what these guys are. They're a collection of peasants armed with javelins designed to harass the unit and nothing more. So, what's these guys all on the battlefield and what do they do in your army? They're an early part of your army. You don't want to keep them for very long though. Because they're javelin men, they don't have long range. And while they can be fairly useful at close range against enemy infantry that's become entangled with your own, because they're javelin men, it means they can be outranged by enemy archers, meaning you can lose the whole unit before you even get a chance to use them in battle. So you're kind of wasting money at that point. However, if you are able to maneuver them properly and avoid them being shot to pieces, they can do somewhat well in flanking attacks against the enemy with their javelins, cutting down the enemy from behind, hitting their undefended rears. They can put in some slight service, and not entirely useless. In melee combat though, they will die. They have nothing defending themselves. You're throwing unarmored peasants against enemy warriors. Even if the enemy warriors aren't well equipped themselves, these guys will die in a clash. So my advice for Untitled coast levies is use them and then get rid of them as quickly as possible, even if it's with just Gondorian sword militia or other militia units. You want to get rid of these troops as quickly as possible. They're brave soldiers, but they're not really soldiers though, are they? They're conscripted peasants. They'll do their job bravely, but ultimately, these are not the heroes of legend that you want your army to be comprised of. They're very much scared farmers who will do their duty and will then run if things get too hot for them. Still a very cool unit nonetheless though, I do quite like them, even if I'm not their biggest advocate for use in battle. However, Gondor doesn't just have these as their javelin units, for Gondor also has more troops in the form of the Pelagia Marines, and these guys are very much a step up from the Untitled coast levies. For starters, these guys have another use that many of the other units in the faction don't. These guys serve as marines on board Gondor's coastal vessels, for Gondor does also have its own navy. It's not the strongest in the world, but it once was. These guys serve quite usefully aboard Gondor's ships, serving both as melee infantry and also as skirmishers. In terms of their arms and armour, all of the men are equipped with javelins, which look fairly historically accurate to me. They've all got heater shields, again a historically accurate thing, and these things do not have metal rims, or do they? I can't properly tell if they have metal rims. If they don't have metal rims, then they're historically accurate. If they do have metal rims, then they are historically inaccurate. In terms of their helmets, they've all got what looks to me to be something akin to a Norman helm, which again, historically accurate. They've all got aventails or chainmail or coifs covering their heads underneath. In terms of their body armour, they've all got brigandine, which is very historically accurate. They've got leather vambraces, which are less historically accurate. However, that does change depending on their size. Little leather cuffs are historically inaccurate. Larger leather vambraces were used more in history. Not necessarily massively, but they were used in the Middle Ages. Some of them also have leather pauldrons, and they also have what I'm assuming are either leather surcoats / breastplates over the top of their gambeson, or it's tegulated armor covered in leather, or something akin to a brigandine. I'm not too sure exactly what it's meant to be, but whatever it is, it looks cool. Is it historically accurate? Well, again, that changes depending on exactly what it is. Also, you can see some of the troops have what appears to be mail underneath their gambeson. So these guys have at least something like 3 levels of armor on. The gambeson alone would be enough for marines to have, because you don't want your marines too heavily armored, because if your troops fall into the water while wearing armor, they're screwed, they're going to drown. So having less armor makes sense, but giving your troops this much overlapping armor seems very weird. Also attached to their helmets are feathers, and feathers attached to their helmets, that is very historically accurate. In fact, it quite reminds me of the helmets worn by Alexander's companion cavalry. Their commanding officer is equipped much the same as his troops. He has an arming sword and the same heater shield. He has pauldrons made of steel, which is historically accurate. He also has a gorget made of steel, which is historically accurate. I can't quite tell if his gorget is under or over the leather breastplate. He also has plate vambraces as well as leather gloves. Their commanding officer is a bit of a weird mix of designs. He's also missing a helmet too, which is, again, a big no-no. The Pelagia Marines roles, as I said before, they serve both on board ships and as infantry on the ground. In both roles, once they're done throwing their javelins, they can switch over to swords and be just as good as hand-to-hand combat as the rest of them. I'd rate these warriors' skills in battle as somewhat equivalent to the Vinglo Veil man-at-arms. They're not quite as good as the Gondorian line infantry, but they do fairly well as a fiefdom unit. And yes, these troops do come from the fief of Pelagia, or rather the city of Pelagia, Gondor's biggest port. So it makes sense for the greatest port of Gondor to have marines stationed in it, and for them to not be able to strip the port of too many troops to send to Gondor's main armies. However, the Pelagia Marines do make for great skirmishers for your army. I would include them, however I am more partial to archer units rather than javelin units, but that's a personal preference more than anything else. And with these guys looked at, I believe that's the last of Gondor's archer units, or ranged units. However, Gondor still has another cavalry unit to look at, and those are the Gondor Cavalry. Just by looking at these soldiers, you can tell they're the same heavily armoured infantry, just now on horseback. They wield the exact same spear, the exact same shield, and the exact same armour. The only real differences between these guys and the Knights of the Silver Swan is that their horses are less armoured. So, for example, they've only got leather faceplates protecting their horses, so these troops are lesser cavalry compared to the Knights of the Silver Swan. Also, these men are not shock cavalry, or at least not the same way that the Knights of the Silver Swan are. Instead, these troops are spear cavalry. They can charge against the enemy rear and do some damage, but their main role is to get stuck in enemy lines and just keep fighting and cause damage on the enemy instead of hitting the enemy hard, then running out, then hitting the enemy hard again, and just doing that cycle repeatedly. These guys do better in prolonged combat to a degree. A useful unit for Gondor's roster for sure, and they're the only unit Gondor can bring apart from the Knights of the Silver Swan. So if you want cavalry, you're most likely going to be looking at these guys more than anything else. Still a fairly useful unit for Gondor to field. They're not the equivalent match for other units' cavalry, such as for example the Rohirrim, but in battle these guys do a fair job against the enemy, and they're definitely a useful part of any Gondorian army. Their officer is distinct. He wears a helmet, so he's a smarter man than most of the other officers, and he doesn't look far different from the rest of his troops. His armor's a little bit more ornate, his helmet's more ornate, and he's got an arming sword rather than the spear/lance that the rest of the troops use. But apart from that, that's the Gondor Cavalry. Useful, but they're not the best cavalry in the game. But then again, Gondor's not a cavalry civilization. It needs troops to fulfill their role rather than troops who excel at being cavalry. And now we'll move on to the final building block of Gondor's armies. It's siege equipment, starting with its onagers. And as you can see, the troops serving as the onager crew are Gondorian Militia, so they can do somewhat alright in battle. But again, the same thing stands for them as stood for the other Gondorian Militia. Only difference is these guys don't have shields. Now, onagers I've spoken about before. They're the one bit of siege equipment that all the factions use, and because of that they're quite useful. They give factions the ability to use siege equipment, so you can knock down walls, knock down enemy fortifications, instead of being forced to purely storm enemy positions. So they do give you options on the battlefield, and that's always something that you want. You don't want to be stuck into one role on the battlefield, being forced to do the same old trick over and over again. However, one thing that I've often said about onagers is that while they are widespread, they're a widespread mediocrity, because there are other units of artillery that far outrange them and are far better quality than these guys. And Gondor is the first faction we've looked at that currently has better quality artillery in its roster, and that is the Trebuchet. And as you can see, it absolutely dwarfs the onagers. And the onagers are based more on artillery that was used during the classical period. So you often hear about catapults and you assume that they're used in the Middle Ages. Well, the truth is they were used far before the Middle Ages, and most of the artillery used in the Middle Ages tended to be more along the lines of trebuchets, being counterweight balanced artillery rather than torsion artillery, like the onagers that we just looked at. The only downside being, of course, that the trebuchet only comes as a 1. So for every unit of trebuchets, you only get 1 trebuchet, compared to the onagers where you get 4 pieces of artillery. So that's something that the onagers have in their favour. In terms of the crew of the trebuchet, they're all Gondorian line infantry, except without shields, so they do somewhat better in battle against enemy forces that reach them, rather than the onager crew. Still definitely a major upgrade over the onager, and it gives Gondor firepower that very few other factions possess when it comes to siege capabilities. So overall, that's Gondor and its unit roster. As I said before, Gondor is my favourite faction in the game, or if not, it's one of my top 5 favourite factions. Overall, as a faction, it is incredibly well balanced. It has good infantry, it has good spearmen, it has good bowmen, its archers and its artillery and its cavalry all complement each other very well. It's very much a well-rounded civilization built on defensive purposes rather than going on the offense. It can bounce back, it can absorb enemy attacks with its heavy spearmen, its heavy swordsmen, its pikemen, its archers, and then it can bounce back on the offense with its artillery and with its cavalry quite well. So it makes for a very dynamic faction that can take a hit and deal out a hit very well. Overall, I'd consider them one of the best factions in the game. If you just like this video, please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Be assured I will be making more of these videos in the future. This was the really big one that I wanted to make a video on, but a lot of the other factions that are coming up I've really been wanting to make videos on too. So please, in the comments, let me know what you think about the video. Let me know if you share my love for Gondor. And I think that'll be about all for me. So, this is Jakov, signing out.